Hello, welcome to the One Life Podcast, where we talk about things from One Life Church, but ultimately things we think can relate to you and your one and only life. My name is Sarah Inman. I'm one of your co-hosts of the podcast, and I'm joined, as always, by co-host of the podcast and our lead pastor, Brett Nicholson.
Hey, Sarah.
Hi, Brett.
So I just thought of this. I have to give a shout out to my wife because I've not done that before on the podcast, but she started with the most recent and worked her way all the way back and is like down to episode 2. I think.
My gosh, really?
And so yeah, she has done. I don't know if anybody else has done that. She may be the one that's done it. And what's more impressive, she listens to me talk all the time, and so she's actually riding around her car.
Continues to listen to you.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I think that's pretty impressive. You know, we should have like some club or something that people like that can belong to. Well, she may be the only one.
You should have a prize.
Yeah,
like a mug.
Yeah, you're right. You should do that. Absolutely. So
you just needed
Krista.
To know that. I appreciate you listening. Yeah. Also, I know Ellen Brown. She's one of our staff members here. Every week sends me a message. Oh, great podcast. So.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So she'll be in that club. That's good.
Yeah. So we're giving Ellen a shout out too. We're just giving shout outs. If you listen to the podcast, email us at podcast@onelifechurch.org.
I'm talking all the episodes though. No cheaters.
That's true.
That's right. That's an exclusive club. I haven't listened to all of them.
I don't. Well, I mean, you were on most of them.
Most of them, but not all of them.
It's probably hard to listen.
And a couple that I missed, I think I didn't listen to.
That's fine.
Which I feel bad.
That's okay.
It's not a very good.
There was one with just me and Bob. I wouldn't listen to that one either. Sorry. He won't listen to this. He didn't care.
Yeah. That's right. Good point.
We are in a series at our church called Restore, Rebuilding the Broken Soul. It's kind of the tagline. And really just at a time and a season of everybody's life where we know that it just feels like everyone needs a moment to kind of just take a breath and focus on restoration. It doesn't need to be this large thing. It can be really simple, maybe just things you didn't realize you even missed. We talked about lamenting. We've talked about faith and kind of talking more, continuing on some more through that journey. And on the podcast, we've been trying to figure out ways that we can talk about some of that, maybe in a more practical way, but also in a way that just maybe has some conversation about some of these. And so today we're joined by somebody I'm excited to just hang out with, my friend Carolyn Edwards. Hi, Carolyn.
Hi.
Carolyn, so first off, we always want to start off just kind of knowing a little bit about who you are. And today what we're going to talk about is grief. I should have said that early on. And some of those things are like, oh, is it going to be sad? Maybe. I don't know. It might be a little bit, but it might just be something that let's talk about it. You know, let's have some of these conversations and some questions that we've come up with that we think might help everybody have a little bit more understanding and go through this process together. So first off, we always want to just start out a little bit knowing about who you are. So tell us a little bit about who Carolyn is.
Who am I? That is such a deep question.
It really is.
That's almost
explore that.
Stumps me right there.
You know, last time you were on the podcast, you've been on the podcast before. You told us you like Star Trek.
Totally.
Yeah, I remember
that. And Picard's been out, and I have to highly recommend it.
I haven't watched it yet.
On CBS All Access.
Oh, really? That's a thing?
It is excellent.
So what does that mean? Does that mean the original Jean-Luc is back, or is it when he was younger? Is it like a...
No, it's him.
It is him, the actual guy. Okay,
yeah.
I didn't know that.
And then...
Sir Patrick Stewart.
And then maybe, is it him?
Oh,
okay.
Is it him or is it not him?
Oh, is that
what
in
the first season, it is him.
Okay, so it is Patrick Stewart.
Aren't you glad that that's what I'm telling you about myself?
That's right, yeah.
And that's probably it in a nutshell.
That sums it up. That sums it up. Well, you play keys on one of our teams.
I do. I play keys on the team and teach now 201.
Yes.
And have been teaching 201 or 101 for I don't know how many years now, but for a while.
That's true. It's like a basics of Christian theology thing for those who may not know that.
Yeah. And then I really here at the church, I probably hang out a lot of time with a bunch of people.
Yeah. Yeah, Carolyn has been somebody for me personally. I'll say this in the last few years, I'm that someone who's been very pastoral in a lot of ways for me, being able to come to and just talk about things that are going on in life. And sometimes it's just like friendly conversations. Sometimes it's more like mentoring. And sometimes it's more of like probably a counseling session of like listening in. But it's been super impactful. And I'm really glad that we've got to be friends. And we get to hang out with another group of friends that we do fun things like rent out the movie theater and watch older movies.
Which I didn't know you could do, which I'm really excited.
I'm going to be doing
Jurassic
Park.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's good. And Carolyn does a lot of that. Carolyn
and Interstellar.
Interstellar, you did watch that at the theater? I needed to watch that again so I'd understand it.
It's amazing. And it's great.
Because as soon as it was over the first time, I was like, okay, I have to watch this again because I didn't follow that very well.
It's deep.
Feel kind of dumb. It is deep. It's very deep. So being a Star Trek fan, you probably could get in the zone a little easier than
unfortunately,
the typical
probably.
Person. Yeah, that's right. Oh, I got it all
because
together.
We just got this theme in my life here going on.
Exactly. She's the Star Trek chick. Yeah.
I am. Star Wars too.
So tell us a little bit about your jobs, some things that you've done in the past, things that you do now, and even when we think about grief specifically, kind of that journey, why that's something that you've worked with a lot, like it's been a part of your journey.
Sure. I've actually been in ministry 31 years.
31.
Yeah.
Wow.
And a third of it was in pastoral ministry in a church. And then I became a chaplain. And so from that time on, so at least 20 years, I've been a chaplain. And I started out first in hospice, and now I work at Gateway. So my beginning with grief, it was personal, and at the same time, I started working at hospice, so that they went together. So on the personal side, my mother had a massive stroke, and she went from being a vivacious, fully alive, active person to being paralyzed and could not talk.
Oh, dear.
And she took care of my dad, who had Parkinson's. And so I became the caregiver of both my mom and dad. And everything in our family changed. And my grief mostly, like the most significant grief in my life, is watching my parents grieve. And having to live, like for her, to still be fully alert, but to be stuck in her body. And to lose their homes, like they lived in Michigan in the winter and then Michigan in the summer and went to Florida in the winter, played tennis and golf every day. The morning she had her stroke, she was up at 5 a.m. working in the garden. And so everything changed in our family. And to even just recently, I'm going through photos. I'm going to start crying. This is going to be a sad podcast.
It's going to be a real podcast.
That's right. It'll be real.
I just saw a picture going through photos of my mother when she finally had to go into a nursing home, and her face was just completely dead. And, just the emptiness that was in her eyes for what her life had become. So she was, our grief was for a person that was actually alive. This wasn't a death. It was a different kind of death that involved more grief than my parents have since died. And I felt much more grief over my mother's stroke than of her death because it was so terrible. At the same time, I went through a divorce. So I was going through a different grieving. And then, coincidentally, I start working for hospice where people are dying.
So one wasn't linked to the other? You didn't think, I've been through this grief, I've experienced it, I want to help others? It was...
No.
Okay.
Really, as I was going through the divorce, I had trained as a chaplain, and I had already worked for a heritage hospice, but I had to stop to take care of my parents. And so, and when we separated to be divorced, I called the guy that trained me, my boss, and said, do you have any openings? And there was an opening for hospice. And so the very week that we separated, the position opened. So I started working for Deaconess Hospice, and I was hired as the chaplain and the bereavement coordinator. I never had been trained in grief. I went to seminary. I took the basic psychology classes. I read Elizabeth Kubler-Ross on the 5 stages of grief, and that's all I knew going in. But I had a lot of pain because at the time of the divorce, I had to put both my parents in a nursing home. And, I took care of them at home. So it was like going through so many different things. And God really, probably is the most significant time of growth for me at that time. But because I knew nothing, I was really honest with the families that had lost somebody And I basically said, I don't know what I'm talking about. You're going to have to help me. And so everything I learned was from people that are grieving. And I had the categories because of my experience. I had the emotions, but I might not have had the depth of like someone that had lost a child. Yeah. But I still had the categories that I could understand to some extent.
Right.
But the best thing I did was I just listened. And I spent a significant amount of time doing grief counseling. We had 3 support groups. Wow. It was a very thriving bereavement program.
Yeah.
So I did that for, I think, 8.5 years. And then I took the position at Gateway. And part of it was because I had too much grief, really. You can only counsel people on grief for so long before you kind of need a break. But God it was like the best of both worlds because at Gateway, we have the humor of working with staff and the fun, but then there's still grief because when I visit patients, they always talk about the death of their loved ones. I mean, they always say, my husband died a year ago. Some will go through every death that they've experienced. So I hear these stories about people grieving. And of course, we do have a lot of people dying, and we are with families, but we're only with them for a very short period of time. So you can't really say a lot about grief from that short period of time that we're with a patient that's dying, and then, we're with the families for, maybe a week. And then, we just you can't say as much as far as what the family will go through. But I do hear these stories still, from patients. We've had patients come in the hospital that, the day before a family member died, and now they're in the heart hospital, and they literally have, like the broken heart syndrome. So I continue probably, maybe once a day to be there for people that are grieving. And the other thing that I've noticed is it's not just grief about death. What people, patients go through are many losses that are related to their illness. So they might be dealing with a loss of finances, loss of independence. Maybe they can't drive anymore. Definitely a loss of dignity when you come into the hospital. Maybe they can't do the things they enjoyed anymore. Maybe they can't work anymore. Maybe they've lost relationships. Maybe, when they're older, all their friends have died. Or they've gone through so many different deaths, lost their home. There's so many losses that people talk about that are significant, and people need to talk about it. They need to. I think people don't talk to their families. People don't like to worry their families. So usually people, keep quiet around their family. But if they have a chaplain that's like anonymous, then
that makes sense.
Then they'll just talk it through. They'll just talk it out. And that's one of the reasons why we're there. That's one of the reasons why we're happy to be there. So that's like a really long explanation of, my grief, the journey. Sorry, that's okay. That was the whole podcast.
Well, it suffice to say that you know a lot about this topic, so you're the right person to be conversing with about it. Yeah. And you said you really weren't familiar with the book side of it, but most of it came from experience.
Yes.
So, and what would you say is important for people to know that perhaps might not be found in a book, at least that you know of? I'm sure it's been mentioned somewhere, but what have you learned from all the listening that you've done, the experience that you've had?
It's interesting because the books are really good. I mean, the books are helpful. So I do want to honestly recommend, especially maybe a devotional. There are grief devotionals that just give you a little bit to think through for the day that people find very helpful. So usually somebody has some book that has helped them. But the thing that I don't hear very much about is guilt. Now, when I worked for hospice, we had about approximately 500 deaths in a year. And so we followed up with all those families. And I called them like a month out. And for everyone I talked to, they all talked about their guilt and their regrets. And so out of all of the things, I mean, there's a lot of different things, a lot of different emotions, but I would say actually that's like one of the most common things I hear is I wish I had done this, or I wish I had done, if only I had done this.
Now, is that related to what's perceived to prevent something, or is it the kind of stuff I wish I would have spent more time, or we would have gone on more walks, or a little bit of both?
Sorry. Hey, by the way,
I like the clapping of the lid.
This is a commercial. This is a really great water bottle.
Well, it's great because it's giant.
It's got times on it, right?
Yeah.
Like how much you're supposed to drink.
Right, I'm sorry, that was
it was time according to the bottle to do that.
That was just to lift our spirits in the middle of this.
I got you.
So it's both.
Okay.
Yeah. So just an example, because both of my parents have died since. I remember the weekend that my dad was dying, but I didn't know he was dying. He was in the hospital and he was delirious. And my dad, we're from Michigan. So we're, total Michigan people. Right. So go blue. And by the way,
I was going to say, I don't know what that would mean. Well, I understand the school, but what it would mean to be a Michigan
If I say Michigan, right, I mean University of Michigan.
You mean the school. You're talking about the school. It's just, the state's irrelevant. Okay.
Yes. Okay. Yes. So anyway, he was delirious and he kept saying, I want to watch Big Ten Network, Big Ten Network all weekend. And so my dad and I always bickered, and I'm like, Dad, they don't have Big Ten Network here. And so we argued the whole weekend about Big Ten Network. Okay, well, Dad ended up dying. And so, the thought at first was, I wish I hadn't bickered with Dad. Yeah. The whole weekend we bickered. Yeah. And because he wanted to watch Michigan sports. Yeah. But I did, fortunately for me, and I don't think this always happens, I did have a vision of my dad right after that, when I thought, boy, I wish I hadn't argued with him all weekend. And I had a vision of Dad, as a young man. And I realized in heaven, he is not thinking about the bickering that we did over the weekend, and he doesn't care. And so I just was able to let go of it. Yeah. But many people cannot let go of it. And many people, I think the thing about guilt, I know you've heard this, where people say, I know that Jesus died for me and God forgives me, but I can't forgive myself. Mm-hmm. That is a hard thing to help a person through.
Right.
And what I learned is as I tried to comfort people and, say, you don't have a reason to feel guilty, that absolutely did not help them at all. Me trying to make a person feel better and, trying to talk them out of their guilt or fix it never helped. So I just realized I just have to listen to them with empathy and, just be there with them in the feelings that they're having with the guilt without trying to make them feel better.
So is there a way through to the other side of the guilt? I mean, if I'm burdened with that, if I'm listening, I'm burdened with that. What's to find you to talk to?
I think that with grief, you will get through it if you don't avoid it. And I think it's just fully acknowledging the emotions that you're feeling. And if you do, you are going to get through it. Okay. If you keep avoiding it, if you obsess about the guilt, that would be one thing. And you might need to get counseling for it later. But at the time that I usually talk to people, in the first 6 months, it is not necessarily the time to work it through.
Sure.
I think it tends to work it through. It works through itself.
Right.
Especially if they do have where they have experienced forgiveness in other ways. I just really trust that somehow it can work it through, unless a person just gets stuck.
Unless you get stuck, that's a caveat.
And people get stuck, and they need to get in counseling. But when I think of stuck, I'm thinking at least a year or so out, not in the first year. I mean, all the emotions that people feel are very normal in that first year, and maybe really in the next couple of years. So if it goes on and on and on, then I think they need to get help. Yeah.
But you made the distinction between ignoring it or avoiding it. Maybe that's the word you used. I don't remember which one was. But if you got to go through it, so don't avoid it.
No, you
so
don't.
How do I avoid it? How do I not avoid it? Is I guess the question I'm trying to ask.
I think it's just it's for any of us to, and I think that's some of what we're doing even now as we're trying to recover from COVID is just admitting what we're feeling. Right. Even the lament, going through the lament was an acknowledgement, of what we were feeling. So I think we try to recognize like what we're feeling. And now with grief, the emotions will be all over the place and people will feel lots of different things in a day. But to actually kind of name it and identify it, respect it, respect that it's a valid emotion. Don't try to talk yourself and say, if I was a good Christian, I wouldn't feel this way. I'm just going to get busy, so I won't think about it. But actually just sit with it for a little bit and acknowledge it. I think that I can't explain how that helps, but it does. And I think that's all. I think we just have to respect it and acknowledge it. And then somehow that gets you started. You
said that grief is an emotion. You have multiple emotional responses. I think we haven't really even said like, how would you even define grief? I mean, obviously it has a lot of definitions, a lot of different. I know you talked about stages of grief. You gave us some resources that we'll post in the show notes for you guys can read through some of these as well. But I mean, how do you, because I think I've heard of grief as a practice, like people can kind of practice grieving, like in doing it well. How would you even, I
don't know.
I don't know. I didn't prep you for that one.
That's hard.
Remember, she didn't do the book thing. She just watched it. So she knows it when she sees it. That's what.
Gosh, what is grief? It is, it's experiencing loss.
Yeah.
I think that's it.
And I mean, that's a simple way to say it, because if there's a lot of other emotions that are going with it. And I love that you talked earlier about like, it's not, most of the time I think we think of grieving. I think of, my first thought is like visiting somebody at a funeral home and like, what do I say to them?
Yes.
Like, what are those things that we say? And I want to ask you those questions, but I do want to say, when we talk about grief, what are some things that we see it even does? You talked about this a little bit. What does it do emotionally and to our bodies? Like physically, like I see people that, can't get out of bed, or like, what are some of those things that maybe you've seen and been, seen people kind of process through?
Yes. Well, actually, a lot of people have a lot of health problems when they are grieving. I actually noticed when I was working for hospice and making the phone calls that there were many times when I couldn't get a hold of a family member because they were in the hospital, because they had a heart issue, their blood pressure was high, maybe had a stroke. A lot of times with people that were caregivers, they ignore their own health. And so then when they lose their loved one, it's like their health just completely falls apart once they're no longer caring for the person. So there are just, headaches, loss of appetite, not being able to sleep, sleeping too much, eating too much, it could go either way, stomach problems, all kinds of health issues, anything, gastric issues, nausea, all kinds of things people can have. And very, very often people are experiencing grief physically. I know, like even for me with COVID, I was very calm all the way through COVID at the hospital, but I did internalize it and I developed a lot of health problems. And so a lot of times we think we're doing great, we're peaceful, and then all of a sudden we're going to the doctor all the time, and dealing with all kinds of stuff. So
interesting to think that sometimes maybe, something that's going on and they're trying to treat a symptom. And in a sense, it's maybe a lack of grieving well. Would you say that? Or maybe it's just a process of grief? I
think that grief takes so much out of a person that it can be when a person's not grieving well. Like, it's like with any emotion not processed well, it can be turned into a physical issue. But sometimes you are processing well and you still have health issues. Yeah. It's just often an issue, especially the sleep. Sleep is often an issue for people.
It's such a drastic change, right? If somebody's in the process, even your experience of how quickly you said everything was different, it's a mixture of that and in a sense, a complete lack of being able to control what's happening.
Absolutely. It's
such a weird, space to be in. I do want to go back to that question of when we talk about somebody, I use this example, I go to visit someone who just lost a loved one at a funeral viewing, and you walk in and it's always like, I don't know what to say. What are some things that people say that maybe, because I feel like everyone's like, I'm so sorry. And it's like, that's just kind of a thing that you say, and not that that's wrong, but are there things that people should say, or what are the things that you, would coach people to say? Or not say.
I would say, I would say as little as possible, because usually people say cliches, and in just leading a lot of support groups, nothing is more upsetting to people than to hear a cliche. So I talked about don't try to fix a person, right, or make them feel better, and I know that sounds really, really strange. But a lot of people try to make people feel better at the funeral home or when they're visiting with them later. And I first would ask, what is our motivation? Because I think it's hard for people to be around intense pain. And we always want to try to fix anyone in intense pain. So a lot of times when we're trying to comfort someone, we may be doing it for ourselves. And when somebody's grieving, they're grieving, and nothing's going to make them feel better. Yeah. Nothing will make them feel better at the funeral home. But what will make them feel better is just that you're there. Purely that you're there, and that you keep it simple. You can even say, I just don't know what to say. Right. But I love you. Yeah. And that's it. I would definitely don't say, if you need anything, call me. That's
really
the worst. Every person says, if you need anything, call me. But people aren't there. And a person that's grieving will not call. Right. But they need you, actually. They need you to be in their lives. So I think, it's like action might be a better thing than words. Well, first of all, at the funeral home, just hug them and tell them you love them. Just keep it really simple. Hopefully they'll talk and listen. If they're talking, just listen. Don't make any promises, but internally make a promise or commitment yourself to that person to follow up with them. Because often what happens after a loss is people disappear. They're there at first, in the first week or so, but then all of a sudden everybody disappears. And what people need the most is for somebody, to say, hey, let's go out and get coffee. And just listen, not to fix them, but just to be with them. Yeah. Or bring them a meal, or, cut the lawn for them. Just do something for them. And that takes courage. Yeah. Because we're all afraid of grief. You know, it's like we all want to tiptoe, like, and so because we're afraid, we often don't do anything. And so then
it's hard to draw close to, because it's intimidating almost.
It is extremely intimidating. And because we can't fix it, we can't make them feel better. We just avoid.
Yes.
So it does take courage. But just an example, the other day, Valentine's Day, I was at Target and I decided to buy cookies for, everybody that lives around me. Okay, we're talking cheap Target cookies that cost like $3, 2 for $6. Okay. So I picked up the cookies and delivered them with a card to all the neighbors kind of like around my house. And the next day, the daughter of the person across the street came running over to me and said, "Thank you so much for those cookies." And she said, "My dad died a month ago. And my mom said, I won't get anything for Valentine's Day this year."
Oh, my goodness. What?
And it was just...
It's a God thing there.
I know. And it was like $3. And I remember thinking, this is really stupid. I mean, who wants store-bought cookies that cost $3? I should be making the cookies myself and delivering them.
Of course you should.
That would be right.
Yeah.
And so it's embarrassing, just to go deliver store-bought cookies. But I did. And it meant a lot to her. So I think a lot of times we have that shame or we have insecurity that keeps us from reaching out. Another example is, and this is from our group, when my sister-in-law died this year, and at the same time, I had developed COVID, and I gave COVID to everybody in the family while we were around her deathbed. So I gave COVID to my brother, who is in his 70s and grieving the loss of his wife. Oh, God. Okay, so that was really
If you can paint a worst case scenario during all this, you just did.
I felt really real. Talk about guilt.
Yeah.
Oh, my goodness. But so, I do have a lot of relationships with a lot of the women in the church and, and some of the guys. And so what they did for me is, brought food, and groceries, and cut my lawn and filled the bird feeders and made hummingbird food for me and picked up prescriptions, all kinds of stuff that they came alongside me and helped me with. Well, that is what a grieving person needs.
Yeah.
And it's just, it takes boldness and courage just to step in and try to be there. Because I deal with grief all the time, I probably have more confidence that when somebody is grieving, like at the hospital, we have so many people that have lost somebody, and I'm able to just go up and like give them a bear hug, despite COVID. But, and that is very comforting to a person just to do that and just, hold them for a long time. It's easier for me as a woman to do that. It's probably would be harder for you, but
probably
a little awkward
or a lot.
But, I think, I always try to make sure I know when there's a death in a family of a staff member, and try to follow up with them and just spend time with them, listening to what's happened and sitting down with them. But I really never give them any advice. Definitely don't say any cliches. Pretty much keep my mouth shut.
What are some of those cliches? Can we just name some of them? Because
sure.
I just feel like we should.
Well, if they lived a long time, well, at least they lived a long, full life. You're not as bad as that person who lost their spouse and their child. They're no longer suffering. They're in a better place.
What about ones that maybe aren't specifically with death?
The same thing.
Yeah.
Honestly, I think when anybody is struggling in any way, say as little as possible and just listen.
More action.
It's I think the greatest guidance on all that is in the New Testament, where it says, rejoice with those who rejoice and mourn with those who mourn.
Yeah.
Somebody celebrate with them, give them a high five, but mourn with those who mourn. If someone's mourning, okay, there's your cue. Just mourn with. I'll never forget when in my wife's dad died, and that was the first kind of encounter I had with something that close. And it really is true. When somebody walked into that room, this is at the funeral home. When somebody walked in the room, that's all I had to do. Oh, they're here.
Yeah.
That was it. And I wasn't waiting around for them to say something. I wasn't like on the edge of my seat, oh, what are you going to say? That's, they're in a better place. Oh, great. Like that's a good line or something. No, it was simply the fact that they walked in the room. I'll never forget that because I had that over and over and over again. Yes. And I thought, oh, okay. But most people, you don't know that until you've experienced it. Yeah. And you said you've got confidence, and that's the big thing. Most of us think we're going to do something wrong, and then we do something wrong. We're intimidated by it because it's like, I'm going to step on your toes that are already sore anyway.
Yes. But your presence is always welcome. Yeah. No matter what. Even if a person's trying to isolate, and that is really scary.
It really is.
Try to reach out. But your presence means a lot. Yeah. Once in a support group, we were talking because no matter what, whether you acknowledge the death or don't, it's hard. For those that are grieving, everything could strike them as off, and so you could offend them no matter what you do. But I asked them, so, somebody was upset because somebody said something. And I said, so would you prefer that somebody say something or not say something at all? As far as just like give them a hug or just acknowledge that they lost somebody. And they said, it's always better for you to acknowledge. So you do want to acknowledge. And the other thing is down the road to continue to acknowledge, because this is another, like a myth. People think that they're supposed to feel better after like 3 months. And they definitely think they should be completely cured after a year. But people that have lost a spouse feel worse after the first year. And anyone that's lost a child, just continues to feel worse. And really that year mark is just everything becomes more real, and they lose more and more of the denial. Denial's there at the beginning, and it's a buffer. And the denial stays longer than you think. So it's gradually fading off during the year. So actually it gets worse and worse and worse. And so people think I'm getting worse and there's something wrong. But actually that's the way it works with people. Yeah. So like, for instance, one of my staff people, her mother died a year ago, Thursday. And I visited her mother every time she was in the hospital. And I always say, how are you doing today? I don't say, how are you doing? Like, don't do that. But like, how are you today? Because it could be a good day, it could be a bad day. And I know that on her birthday, I bought her cardinal earrings because cardinals always remind her of her mother. And I'm going to get a bush, like a rose bush for her for Thursday, to remember her mother. And, it's just, I will acknowledge. I won't tell her what to do. I won't try to comfort her or anything like that, but she'll know I'm there for her. And then I remember. And so like people continue to need support down the road. And I was gonna say, because in a sense too, you're acknowledging that that's happened too, because for her, she feels like no one else remembers this. Like it's something that I just live with. Yeah. And so, I have a friend that like I'll consistently ask maybe questions about someone in her life who had passed and try to use his name, like even to remind, because I feel like that's just to remember like, oh, you know who that is. And that, like, do you feel like that's something that,
Okay.
Yes.
I think so often people almost are afraid, like, do I even talk about it? I don't want to bring it up because I don't want to make them sad. And I feel like most of the time when I have, people like, they engage in conversation almost like, thank you for asking.
Yes.
And it does seem to be healing in a sense.
A good friend that lost her husband early. He was only 32. And she could tell everybody was avoiding mentioning him because they were afraid that it would somehow bringing him up would make her sad. He's like, she said, I'm thinking about him all the time.
Yeah.
You know,
she's sad.
That's all I'm
time.
thinking about. And so bringing him up, you're not doing anything new for me.
No.
You're actually doing me a favor. And so, you know, it cheered her whenever people would tell stories about him. Oh, remember the time that that kind of thing. Yeah. So it's kind of counterintuitive for most of us, but we need permission to, it's okay. Thing to do.
Yeah.
Do it.
And, you know, actually now that makes me think when you do visit, you know, go to the funeral home, if you have a memory of that person, that's a good thing to share.
I usually try to do that with someone I'm close with because I'm a story person. I'm a visual in that, especially if you walk around, there's some great pictures. And I love to say, oh, I'd never seen that picture, you know, like, because a lot of times those are, and then you get a really fascinating story.
Yes.
You know, or you see a friend, you're like, oh my gosh, look how, you know, funny you looked there. You know, it's like, and try to just bring some lightening of, not to make them feel better, but to be like, oh wow, like try to bring them back to a memory that hopefully
absolutely. And when people are dying, and I'm in the room with the family, we often have times of sharing stories. I'll just ask them, like, you know, what was your mother like? And you get some pretty interesting answers for that. But, you know, to ask that and invite them to share stories, and definitely to mention their name for sure. Yeah.
Because it makes people feel better in the sense that I've watched people do that, and they'll start telling stories, and then they will. I've heard uproarious laughter in a funeral home, and it goes back and forth, but that's part of it. It's fascinating to watch, and it's a good thing.
Yeah. And just even the idea of commenting on a picture would be a great idea. Or asking about a picture. I think that would be great. But the big thing is you're not trying, you're letting them do the talking.
Yeah.
You're just, you're giving them an in so that they can start talking.
And even if that, like, because I've been in a handful of moments where you go up and like, hey, I'm so sorry, you know, I love you. And there's just this awkward moment of like, and you just kind of let it be awkward, and I usually move on because I'm just awkward sometimes. But most of the time, I don't want to add to, you know, to try to, like, because a lot of times what I'm worried, I think what you said this, like, we're worried about making ourselves feel less uncomfortable.
Yes,
and that's the least thing you want to focus on.
Yeah, it is definitely. It requires courage.
Yeah,
but you know, it's good for us to be courageous. You know, it is relationally courageous.
Hey, thanks for joining us for part 1 of our conversation with Carolyn Edwards, talking about grief. And we actually split this episode into 2 parts, so you should listen to part 1. Part 2 will actually come next week. We usually go every other week on episodes, but we're going to have a special episode next week in part 2. We asked Carolyn, how does this idea of grief point us to God? And also Carolyn shares some of her practical resources, and you can find those resources again in the show notes, but she's actually going to walk through each one of those next week. Thank you guys so much for joining us, and we hope to see you next time.